it's hard to describe exactly what it feels like to be back in Prague. I've only been to Prague once before. It was 14 years ago. It was for only a week. I was, at the time, I was studying in Copenhagen. I studied primarily at the University of Toronto, but I took a semester away. I went to Copenhagen to study a philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard. And while I was in Copenhagen, I made a little side quest here to Prague. And I'm not just saying this because I'm in Prague. I've never been so dazzled by a place, quite like I was with this city. And it's hard to say why. I'd been to a lot of beautiful cities. I'm living in Rome right now. That's a beautiful city. But there was something about this city that just felt a little bit enchanted to me. And I developed what seemed at the time to be a very private relationship with it. I went on a lot of walks by myself, day, night, many, many hours. And I felt like I got to know it as you would get to know a person. You get to know a person very gradually, and the more you get to know a person, the more you realize you don't know a person. The more aspects of a place you see, the more you realize that there's more that you haven't seen, and so on and so forth. And Prague always seemed to me like a place of depth and mystery, and there was something faintly, almost numinous about it. And maybe it was just the time in my life that it was. It was my first time away from Toronto, where I grew up for a long, long period of time, and the world was kind of opening up. I was young enough at the time that when I stayed in Prague, I was surfing on strangers' couches rather than staying in hotels. I must say Prague was probably the easiest place to do that because I found it to be exceedingly open and generous, and I had some very, very fun nights with my new friends whose couches I slept on. Some nights I don't remember too clearly, to be quite honest. But it was a city I never forgot, and that was 14 years ago. So there's something that feels very meaningful about coming back. When I was here last time, I bought a painting. It's the kind of painting that, remember, I was on a student budget, so this was a very cheap painting. And there's, in a factory somewhere, there's probably about 50,000 of them. But to me, it was very special. It was kind of the bridge, of the Charles Bridge and of the castle in the background. It was very typical. But at the time, I really cherished it. And I went home and I put it, once I got my own apartment, a few years later, I put it right in the center of my apartment. And I had it up for 10 years. And I just took it down 6 months ago, before I left Toronto. And even though it is a painting that probably thousands of other people have up, depicting a scene that millions of people come to see all the time, there's nothing original about it at all, and yet my relationship with Prague, because of that precise moment, because of who I happened to be, because of exactly where I walked and when and how I felt at the time, created, I think, something that was unique to me or felt unique to me. I felt like I had an individual relationship with the city, even though millions of people probably feel the exact same thing. And there was something ironic, I guess you could say, about feeling so personal about a scene and about a city that millions and millions of people come to see and probably feel identically about. And yet, there's still something very private to me about how I experience the city, even though there's nothing private about it at all. Something about the irony of that is actually what I want to talk about today. And it's fitting that it should be in Prague that I do it. Thank you to Adam, especially for facilitating this. Thank you to H21, and some of you I've met already, some of you I haven't. I just really appreciate the invitation. It's very generous. And one thing I hope, I'll talk for a little while, and then what I'm really hoping is that we can just all talk. It's a small enough group that's possible, because I'd like to get to know you a little bit. And so feel free to react however you'd like to react. And then I'm kind of curious to know what you're bringing into today, because what you've brought into it will determine what it means, ultimately. So the title of the talk originally was the meaning crisis and the concept of privacy. And we'll get to privacy eventually, and the meaning crisis will sort of always be in the background, and eventually we'll actually talk about it directly. But just the meaning crisis, the nature of what we, John first, and many of us after, came to call the meaning crisis is ambient, right? The whole nature of it is that it's in the background. You can never put the meaning crisis in front of you and say, look, there's the meaning crisis. I found it. No, it's everywhere. And it's also nowhere, right? It's a fog. And because of that, it's very difficult to disambiguate. It's difficult to know what we're talking about when we talk about it, because like the experience I had in Prague, except inverted, perhaps, into a pain, it's something that is not personal at all, and yet we all experience it acutely as a personal affliction. So this weird paradox of something that is both universal to us all and also profoundly personal and acute, that line, however we might name it, is precisely what we mean when we talk about the existential import of the meaning crisis. There's a quote from Kierkegaard, who I was studying when I first came to Prague, and the quote is one of my favorites of his. And if I was to retitle the talk, this quote would be the title. The quote goes like this: "Popular opinion maintains that the world needs a republic, needs a new social order and a new religion. But no one considers that what the world, simply confused by too much knowledge, needs is a Socrates." So if I was to retitle this, I would title it Too Much Knowledge. Too much knowledge. Because I think something about what we experience that we come to call the meaning crisis, especially now, here, has a lot to do with just having too much knowledge and not knowing what to do with it, where to put it, how to treat it, and what it actually means to us. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about me. I'm not an academic. I do work with a lot of academics. John Vervaeke is probably the most notable one, but he's not the only one. I've spent a lot of my time and life and career saturated in academic company, even though I always feel like I'm kind of on the outside of it. I'm not a lawyer, but I've had the same experience working with a lot of lawyers in government for many years, doing a lot of lawyerly things, but always feeling a little bit outside of that. I tend to call myself a writer because it's ambiguous enough and meaningless enough that it kind of gets away with just about everything, and it allows me to kind of step back and not have to claim too much when I use it. But I think the most relevant part of me and part of what I do to today, and this is something I share with Adam, and it's also the circumstance of how we met, is being a Socratic counselor. I say Socratic counselor rather than philosophical counselor. They're close enough that we could use them interchangeably. Socratic counseling specifically is a kind of philosophical counseling that I am attempting in this very moment to develop with two of my colleagues, Ryan Barton and Rick Rapetti. And essentially what it is a form of philosophical counseling that is particularly referential to the figure of Socrates in the Socratic tradition. People look for philosophical counseling for a lot of different reasons. We were actually having a discussion about this today. Some of them are looking for bibliotherapy, which is a way of saying, I want to know more and I want you to recommend some books that might be well suited to me, that might kind of get my juices flowing a little bit. Some people go because they're stuck on a very specific problem in their lives, right? I don't know whether to break up with my girlfriend or not. I don't know whether to move houses. I don't know whether to move cities. I don't know whether to stay in this job or leave this job. I need someone to help me get outside of myself for 5 seconds so that I can look at a problem with some degree of distance and figure out what I'm not seeing. Some people come because they just want to learn about philosophy, and the counselor becomes like a tutor. And there's nothing wrong with any of these. Socratic counseling, this is also very similar to people like Pierre Grimes or Ron LaHave, people who have tried to take a more, let's say, a more bird's eye view of what counseling is, has more to do with figuring out what we believe without knowing that we believe. That's another way of saying every day when we make decisions and have conversations and meet people and chase this and avoid that, we're all carrying around beliefs. And belief is kind of an unfortunate word because what we usually think we mean by beliefs is like right on the very top soil. It's like an opinion or, a statement of preference. And that's not the way we mean belief in this sense. What we mean belief is kind of like what Kierkegaard called a life view. It's like the very thing that you're in, the relationship you have with your life, right? Think of it that way, right? When you're in a relationship with something or someone, it's not an opinion, it's not a statement of fact, it's a whole way of being. It's what you do with your attention, and it's what your body reacts to, right? And so when we mean belief in the Socratic sense, we mean what is the paradigm, what is the way of seeing the world, living with the world, being in the world, that the person acts out every day by what they say, by what they do, by the decisions they make, by what they value, that they're actually not fully aware of because they look through it, not at it, right? So if I was John Vervaeke right now, I would take off my glasses. Those of you who are familiar with his work, this would be the moment where you take off the glasses and you look and you put them back on, right? They are the things that we look through that we don't know that we look through. Backlight the world from behind us. And so the purpose of Socratic counseling in this sense, or philosophical counseling, is to try and get at those. And those are hard to get at because they're not at the forefront of our consciousness, right? We live through them, but we usually can't name them. And because of that, we need help. And we all do, right? Because when you're with somebody who can help tease out the way that you think and the way that you see and hold it for you and put up a mirror and go, this is what I see when I look at you. This is what I see when I talk to you. This is how I experience you. This is the kind of person I experience you being as I come to know you, not just with my logic, not just with my opinions, but with my whole nervous system. When you sit with somebody and give your care and attention over to trying to figure out what it is that they're doing with their attention, and you give that back to them, that's a really, really powerful gift. It's a gift of helping them know themselves. It's self-knowledge, as we would say in the Socratic tradition. Socrates very famously called himself a midwife for the soul, which sounds very highfalutin. But effectively what it meant was there's something that already inheres you, there's something already inside of you, and you can't get at it. And I am the person who is going to sit here with you, use questions, use curiosity, use observations, use stories, use ideas, use whatever, to try and get at that thing that's already inside of you that maybe you can't get at yourself. Because none of us can, because we are beings who discover ourselves in relation. And somehow being in relation, in dialogue with other people, is the way that we dialogue with ourselves, right? So this whole tradition of Socratic dialogue that we find in Plato, all the way up to very modern philosophical counseling, has to do with the fact that my relationship with myself and my capacity of getting to know myself and figure out who I am and what I actually believe and what forces are at work within me depends on me finding someone or someones who are going to care enough and be interested enough to sit down with me and to take an interest in that for me. Sometimes we're too afraid of ourselves to be genuinely curious about ourselves because there's all kinds of things in there that we really don't want to find out, because we're probably going to learn things about what we believe that we would rather not learn. That's true of all of us. And so someone who can be there with us and love the thing that we don't yet know about ourselves enough for us to know it is the person who has what we might call a Socratic eros, right? Eros in a non-sexual sense, right? Eros in the way that it was originally meant, which is the coming to know someone by sharing in the process of being who they are and helping to bear some of the burden. Because being all of us is tough. It's heavy being yourself. And if it doesn't feel heavy yet, it's probably because you haven't thought about it too much yet. Being a person is not an easy thing. And so that's where Kierkegaard picks up from the Socratic tradition, because Kierkegaard is someone who wakes up and thinks, wait a second, being myself isn't something that just happens automatically. It's not something I grow into or age into. It's a decision I have to make. I have to become what I already am by becoming conscious of parts of myself that are always in a state of longing and restlessness and pain. And the meaning crisis, so named, on the one hand is about these grand historical sweeping forces that have evolved us in certain ways over the course of time. But in a meaning crisis, in, let's say, a vertical sense, in the sense that is always true and always has been true, is that experience of sort of lying in bed at night at 4 a.m. and thinking, what the hell am I? Why? What am I doing? What should I be doing? Am I a good person? Am I a person at all? Are any of my thoughts my own? Have I ever made a decision in my entire life, or have I just been directed by the winds? What am I doing? Right? And there's no obvious answer to any of those questions. And when we think about them for too long and live inside of them for too long, something opens out underneath us and attempts to swallow us. And Kierkegaard called that despair. But despair is not a problem to be avoided. For him, and for really that whole tradition that Socrates began, that despair or that aporia, that what do we do? That's the beginning. That's where the good stuff starts. That's where the meaningful project actually begins, right? Nothing is lost at that point. Actually, you're only beginning to stumble on what's important when that has happened. And until that happens, something hasn't become fully conscious yet. That's why Socratic counseling is not always fun. It's uncomfortable, and it involves confronting ourselves in ways that we would really rather not do. And in order to do that, safely, let's say, and by safely I mean in a way that doesn't just bring about a total destruction of us, we need to do that in privacy. We need privacy in order to come to know ourselves, and in order to have people know us in a way that can reveal without unduly exposing, which is that we need to be heard in the right register, right? You need to be heard by the right set of ears in order to be able to hear yourself through them. And so that relationship in counseling is critically important, just as it is for friendships, any kind of relationship, right? If you're speaking into a comprehending ear, you're much more likely to speak true, because you know the ear is generous. You know the ear actually is leaning in to understand. And if someone leans in to understand you, they will draw out something that is perhaps something you've never heard yourself say before. And that's where the revelation happens. That's where insight happens. But in order for that to ever be possible, there is a sacredness in that relationship that has to be honored. And that sacredness, in part, is provided by privacy. So privacy. I worked for many years in government. And I did two things. I did freedom of information, which is sort of like when you see documents from the government hit the news and they have these big black redactions through them. That was me. Not that instance of it, maybe, but that's what I did. That was my first job out of school, was a freedom of information analyst, a redactor. you might say. It was a very strange, very interesting job. I had all kinds of strange feelings about it. It involved interpreting legislation to figure out what kind of information could or couldn't be released. And the other half of my life in government was spent working on privacy legislation. Privacy and freedom of information have this weird relationship in international law. Usually, not always, but often they're paired together because there's some weird intuition that the publicity of government life and the privacy of personal life are somehow related, that they somehow depend on each other. So Alan Weston was a Canadian scholar, early scholar for privacy, and he said, modern totalitarian regimes rely on a high degree of publicity for the personal lives of their citizens and a high degree of secrecy for the state. Conversely, democracies, if they function well, rely on a high degree of publicity for the state and a high degree of privacy for the person. It's strange, right? It's not so much about just protection of the person. It also has something to do with how the person participates in the world around them. When I moved into public policy for privacy, it was at a time when big data, this is around maybe 2018, 2017, everyone knew by that point that we were all in trouble because the amount of data that could be collected, it used to be that privacy was about drawing your curtains at night and getting protection from the surveillance of the state. It was all about the state. It was all about the power of the state. And it was all about the separation of identities, my personal private life from my public official persona. And privacy was really about the separation of identities. And there was some intuitive wisdom in that. And the wisdom was never really articulated into law, but I think the wisdom had something to do with the fact that in order to maintain the integrity and the balance in your life, the different faces that you take to the world somehow need to be separated from one another. We are all multiple in a very critical way. And in order to be multiple safely, our multiple aspects somehow need to get some distance from one another. And if they get some distance from one another, then there can be this sort of central balance or the central control or this way in which they can relate to each other harmoniously. And if one trespasses on the other, there's this disorientation and confusion of identity. But if the identities remain discrete from one another, the person can somehow modulate them, perhaps not even consciously, and there can be some degree of balance in which a person can be safely multiple, and in the middle of all that multiplicity find some central pattern, some kind of harmony between the parts. The event of big data changes all of that, and also it removes the focus from governments, because now it's not simply governments we're worried about, it's virtually every app provider that exists in the world that collects data at such a microscopic level that the profiling that can be done about a person is so thorough that by some definition of the term, they can know you better than you know yourself, right? This is what we call biopsychosocial metrics. This is some work that I'm doing now as a consultant with Sunday Labs. John Vervaeke is also part of that work. We're trying to figure out what privacy actually means in this new world of data, because it's actually not obvious at all. Because now what's possible with big data that wasn't possible when these first quaint ideas of privacy were developed is that using the data that is taken from every commercial interaction that you have with your phone and other devices, the level of detail that can be ascertained about you when it's aggregated, when it's put into a profile, can predict and know, at least theoretically, your movements, your preferences of taste, your preferences for art, your sexual preferences, where you like to eat, how you interact with people, the state of your health, how much you sleep at night, what you want for yourself, what you don't want for yourself. Essentially, it creates a very detailed profile of fear and desire. And now there are very sophisticated ways of pulling on the levers of fear and desire in order to direct people as you would direct rats in a maze. It's a very, very dehumanizing world that now becomes possible. Now, I don't mean to sound alarmist when I say this. This is just the reality that we live in now. It is possible to do this, and it has been done, and there have been some very high-profile instances of it that have hit the news and caused great scandal. Cambridge Analytica was perhaps the most famous of those. The point is that we're now able to look at a person, image a person, in a way that microscopes details about their lives that are so thorough that it can give us this idea that we know who they are. And of course, the consequences of that can be very material. Identity theft and reputational damage, and you can steal from someone or shame them or publicly humiliate them. There are all kinds of material things that you can do to somebody with their data. And all of that is important, and I'm not talking about any of it. Because that's what privacy law focuses on, right? We can get our hands around that. We can measure that. We can measure when your identity is stolen. We can measure when there's financial damage. We can measure certain consequences of that. And those are very easy to measure. That's not the problem for philosophy. That's not the problem for Socrates. And as I did that work in public policy, I was part of a team that was trying to draft a new private sector privacy law for the province that I lived in Canada. And as we were doing that, one thing became very clear to me, which is that nobody actually knew what privacy was. Everyone agreed it was important. Nobody could tell me what it was, like what it really was. Everyone said, well, this data, it's harmful, it's destructive. Yes, okay. And, well, it can lead to all these concrete harms. Yes, okay. But what is it? What's privacy good for? Why does it matter? Why do we value it? Well, it's about autonomy and agency. Okay. What is that? What does that mean? Now, if you keep asking these pestilent questions like an 8-year-old or a Socrates would ask, what happens is you get down to something like freedom. Okay, freedom, great. So privacy is about freedom. Is privacy freedom? Well, no, not exactly. They're different, okay. But privacy is for freedom. Yes, it's for. It's not freedom, but it's what allows for freedom. Great, okay. Now, this is the Socratic move because what Socrates used to do is, if you've read any of Plato's dialogues, and if you haven't, who cares, it's fine, but Socrates would go around asking people about virtues. And for many, many, many centuries, scholars usually interpreted that as a very intellectual exercise. He's interested in what courage is, like in the abstract. And it's unfortunate that many people who study philosophy study it in such a way that they think that that's what Plato was interested in. The abstract idea of what courage is or justice is. It seems clear, though, or at least it seems preferable to me. I'm biased in favor of a different interpretation, which is that the process of interrogating a virtue is a process of interrogating someone's relationship to life. Because our relationship to virtues is ultimately what determines how we stand in the world. Virtues are these weird things. They're real because we all share them, but they're particular. We all have our different relationship to them, right? Like me in Prague, right? Courage literally is a universal. It has symbols attached to it that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. But we all have a very different idea of what it looks like in action. And yet we all have a relationship to it such that we measure ourselves by how much we fall short of it, how close we get to it, how well we do when we manage to embody it. Virtues are these weird things that are somehow the keys to accessing ourselves and each other and the society and the world that we want to live in. They scale at every level. And so what Socrates is doing when he says, hey, what's courage? What do you think? He's trying to get access to all those beliefs, all those hidden ways of being that you live by that are expressed by you expressing your relationship to courage. And so by doing that for virtue, he could get at how someone stands in relationship to life. It occurred to me at some point while doing all this work on privacy that no one had ever thought to do that about privacy. Privacy might not be a virtue, but it seems to be related to all these other virtues, right? It seems to be this idea that it's somehow at the core of what it means to be a person. How we relate to shame, how we relate to guilt, how we relate to exposure and vulnerability. Something about the tender underside of our humanity seems very bound up with privacy. And yet, I never saw a Socratic dialogue in government policy making where someone tried to go, hey, but if we're going to try and create a law about this, maybe we should understand something about what it means to us. Maybe we should sit down and ask ourselves this question: what is the nature of it in the first place? Because what happens instead when people convert intuitions into public policy and then convert public policy into law is they're usually sourcing those intuitions from a crowd to keep the favor of an electorate, or they're sourcing them from God knows where, and they're just presuming that something they believe is correct because they have a force of conviction about it. There is no process for interrogating an assumption, and there's no process for trying to get at the intuition. And so as soon as that became clear, I just remember thinking, I don't know what we're doing here anymore. I don't know what I'm doing here anymore, because I don't actually know what we're attempting to achieve, because I don't fully know the subject that we're actually talking about. And that moment when you realize, wait a second, this thing I'm thinking about and writing about and talking about, I don't know what it is, because it's a name put on a something or other that can't be named. That's the moment when the aporia happens. That's the moment where you just go, oh. And that moment is what we call Socratic ignorance. Everything has to somehow dissolve. Everything has to break for a moment, right? The world has to be put into suspension. When you realize, I'm living things out without knowing what I'm living. I'm thinking things without knowing what I'm thinking. And there are forces that I've never named that determine where I go, what I do, and what I find important. And if that process is essential to do as individuals, it occurred to me, why aren't we doing that when we're trying to create entities, laws, rules in the world that are actually trying to codify what it means to be a good human being, what a good human being needs to thrive? How am I doing for time?
10 minutes.
Great. Perfect time for another swig of beer. So, what we're now doing is we're trying to get at this question of what privacy is. And it's something that's just started, and I don't know where it's going. But it has something to do with accessing those intuitions that were at work all those years when I was working in government. Those ideas about freedom, those ideas about autonomy, those ideas about agency. It's like we need this for our humanity. Because what's at stake now, and it's been at stake for a long time, because as the eternal, let's say, if I can use a word like that, the human being's connection to the eternal is one of the things that has been fading in the modern world, right? If you've seen or read or heard about Awakening from a Meaning Crisis, that's effectively the story in a nutshell, not to spoil it. But the idea is that because of both a perennial conflict within the person and because of a series of events taken place over the course of history that changed the way we understood what a person is, the person is being desacralized, right? That idea that a person carries within a piece, within her or him, a piece of the eternal. that there is some connection between the person and something outside of just the physical, temporal confines. That idea that there's a divine spark, it's a very, very old idea, that there's a divine spark. And you can think of that however you like. You don't have to think of it within a particular religious tradition, but just think of it as a core idea that there's this divine spark within a person, that a person, despite being so feeble, so fragile, so foolish, so destructive in so many ways, and so animal in so many ways, has this foothold in something deeper. And one of the things that we're straining under right now is the fading out of that feeling, the dissolution of whatever force it was that kept the human being together in reference to something greater than him. And that desacralization, that sort of emptying out of spirit, that sort of, Kierkegaard described it as almost like an asphyxiation. Like I can't get a deep breath. My breath is shallow. I'm hyperventilating. We're not breathing as deeply as perhaps we once did, which could just be a very nostalgic thing to say. But it's a sensation, right? This is genealogy. This is myth in a way. I'm speaking mythically, not historically. There's a way in which we're somehow short of breath when it comes to the spirit. And that has to do with what a person actually is. Now, that was already true, and that was already at stake 20, 30, 50 years ago. What's happened now with data, with how we can know a person virtually, is that we can put together microscopic details about a person that seem so thorough that they give us the idea, the sense of certainty that we know a person. But the way of knowing a person through data, the way of knowing a person through these virtual means are empirical, they're animal, and they're distant. They don't involve the knower, right? There's an old idea that comes from probably primarily Augustine, this idea that in order to know, you also have to be known simultaneously, which is a way of saying, if I look at you based on a profile of your data, I'm not implicated in that at all. My status, my position as the knower is completely uninvolved. It's subtracted from the equation, which makes it precisely the opposite of that process I was describing to you before, that Socratic process of being deeply, deeply implicated in the knowing of you, being involved in the knowing of you, having a stake in you, being interested, being curious, being concerned. That the way we come to know each other as people, that opens someone up and makes a person mysterious, is completely absent from this form of knowing. We have all this knowledge of a person to the degree that we can predict their movements, predict their purchases. We can nudge them and reliably induce desires and fears in them the way we would an animal. And we can really do that. We can access the animal part of the person. And that gives us a presumptive knowledge. That gives us the idea that we can know a person with this kind of dispassionate, empirical distance. And that might cause harm to that particular person, but what it's actually doing is something deeper, which is that it's degrading slowly our idea of what a person is, the way in which a person can be known. And it's speeding up that process of desacralizing the human being by removing their mystery. If you'll allow me a metaphor, it's not even a metaphor, it's just a way of describing it. It's the difference between eros and pornography, right? Think of the way we see each other through data as being pornographic, right? Stripping somebody naked gives you the impression of knowing that person. But of course, there is no real knowing of the person, right? There's something shortcut and crude about the knowing that you have about a person when they're simply stripped naked in front of you. That's why it's a historical act of shaming and punishment. Knowing in the Socratic sense is more erotic, not in the sexual way, but in a sense that it involves a union of identities. It involves the knower and the known being somehow united in the same process of discovery and of revelation. And there's something about the human being that is only disclosed in that process. And we call it dialogue. It sounds like an awful, feeble word for it. But it's that process where two people are knowing something deeper about the world and themselves because of knowing each other. And the more they come to know each other, the more mystery there is to be known, and there's the sense in which the world opens up. And the way that we now are tempted to know a person, or that we're capable of knowing a person by aggregating all of their movements, all of their involuntary thumbprints in the world, is precisely the inverse of that. And the more that we rely on that, and the more that we recourse to that, and the more that becomes commonplace, and it is, the more and more and more that self, the interior experience, the thing that can't be named or expressed, the thing you feel inside of you at 4 a.m. when you're lying in bed, is thought not to exist because it's ignored. And so it seems that if we continue this Socratic process by asking questions about privacy, that privacy has something to do with recovering the erotic in favor of the pornographic. It has something to do with helping a person remain concealed so that they can be revealed in the right way to the right person in the right time. It has something to do with helping a person stay silent so that they can hear themselves and be heard by the right person in the right way at the right time. It's subtracting the noise so that something can come clearer. This is a very, very hard thing to codify. I have no idea how we would try and do that. But if we know what privacy is for, what virtues it's trying to inculcate, what it's trying to protect, then we have some idea of at least what we're talking about, and we can begin to imagine how to protect this and how to preserve it. Something about privacy allows a person to be more human, allows them relief from their persona long enough to hear something more real, long enough to remember something before their identity. It allows them to commit errors, to sin, if I can use that word, without a complete destruction of their life, as we all do and we all need room to. So it turns out, and this is just a proposal, this is not the answer, but this is a proposal, that this thing that I spent all these years trying to circumambulate and translate into law and policy actually had far higher stakes than any of us ever thought, because it wasn't protecting a person from identity theft. It wasn't protecting a person from financial repercussions. It was protecting an image of the human being in general and protecting something tender, something fragile, but something profoundly spirited about the human being in the process. And we can't even approach that reality without undertaking the process of coming to know why we value the things that we do. And so I'm convinced now, or if not convinced, highly suspicious of the fact that public policy, the world I swam in for so many years, and law, and all of those things that involve registers of a greater scale, need a Socrates. Because only a Socrates actually inquires into the source and meaning and impetus for why we value the things that we do for long enough to hear it clearly. I want to read you one thing, and I'm going to stop. That's another quote from Kierkegaard. Opened with him, so I'll close with him. It's from a book called The Present Age, which was written in the 19th century. And, well, you can tell me. What is talkativeness? It is the result of doing away with the vital distinction between talking and keeping silent. Only someone who knows how to remain silent can really talk and act, essentially. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for interesting contemplation about the topic of privacy. We will now have about half an hour to 45 minutes for questions and discussions. So the floor is open, and I'm going to be moderating the discussion. So if you have anything you would like to say or ask, how is the time? Okay, boy. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Okay. And the word what is coming to my mind, especially by the end, is the intimacy. Because it's very intimate, no? What is private for us. But intimate can be as well the dialogue or compassion. It's a very intimate thing. So how we can kind of publicly open up more floor for intimacy to really be able to work what matters for people, but not to abuse them in a way. Thank you.
I think intimacy is the perfect word. It's a word I wish I had used, but that's exactly right. It makes me think of something, a good friend of mine and a colleague who has helped design some of these philosophical practices. His name is Guy Sengstock, and he's one of the founders of circling. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, which is sort of an authentic relating practice. He said something once which I thought was brilliant. He made this distinction between vulnerability and exposure. Both involve the bearing of oneself in some way, except in the case of vulnerability, at least in the way he meant it, it was intentional, right? There's a big difference between disclosing yourself because you've decided to disclose something and being forced to disclose something, right? It's like when someone comes behind you and pulls down your pants. That's a moment of exposure, and there's shame that attaches to that. But vulnerability, and what I think you mean by intimacy, is intentional and deliberate. And it turns out that that distinction means everything, right? When you're with someone who you trust and you disclose something, you reveal yourself as an intentional act, it's a very, very powerful thing, as opposed to if, someone suddenly opens the door on you or pulls the curtain on you. So I think of intimacy as sort of the vulnerability side of the spectrum as opposed to the exposure, if that makes any sense. Yeah, I think that's very apropos. Thank you.
Well, Libby, I have a question. So you mentioned that you were working for many years on the field of privacy, and then at one point you had an aporia, the realization that actually you don't know what you are working on and what you are talking about. Well, in the Platonic dialogues, aporia usually happens as a result of Socrates' questioning. I was wondering what caused your aporia, and what is your recipe to reach this point of aporia, perplexity?
I think it was being involved in actively involved in the process of trying to create law. I had never had that experience before. And one of the things I saw was this constant game of balances, right? It was like, I'm trying to think of a good visual metaphor for this. So like the game whack-a-mole comes to mind a little bit when you're trying to get the perfect balance of something. Or like when you're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, and you've got all side finally one color, and you go, yeah, but now the rest of it's like ruined, The more emphasis you put on this, it takes the balance off of that. Put more balance on this, it takes the balance off of that. So because you're always trying to satisfy all kinds of different interests, and you're also trying to somehow offset all of the possible harms, all of the possible misinterpretations that could come about as a result of saying it this way or saying it that way. And I just saw this game of constant compromise, this constant game of toing and froing and pulling this and compromising that. And it was like trying to it was like trying to pick up a glass with 2 fingers rather than 4 fingers and a thumb. It was like the tool was not adequate because the tool did not understand what it was actually reaching for. And I think it was just in one of those days or session. And I was working with wonderful people who were very smart and very committed and trying their best. And there was no lack of brain power. But there was something fundamentally in tension about what we were doing. And it occurred to me after one of these, we would have these long sessions together where we were trying to work this out. And it just occurred to me one day that part of the problem was that privacy was taking on so many different images. It was trying to mean so many different things simultaneously that we were constantly compromising one definition in favor of another. And so it lacked a stable identity. So it was just the process, and that process was so full of inquiry. But it's amazing. When you try and build something, you just start thinking about the materials more. Something like that. Something like that.
So I have a question about the freedom and privacy concept. So technically, like being free and not having privacy, like based on what you said, it might not be possible at all, because and my question is about the mental freedom. You know, if I don't have privacy and I don't do anything illegal, if I don't care about what people think of me, what they consider me being because they Google me or something, so this mental freedom of not caring and not having the privacy, do you think this is possible in a way like? Would you say the person is still free?
That's a great question. Well, let me maybe ask, this is a really good question. Let me maybe ask a question to all of you in turn that I think is relevant, and then I'll answer. Let's say there was a company who had complete access to you, complete access to all of your data. And let's say it's basically your OS, it's your phone provider, okay? And they essentially have such a microscopic amount of detail about you that they effectively know more or less everything. They know what your tastes and your preferences are, they know where you go, they know what you do, they have access to all of your discussions, all of your WhatsApp chats, all of your correspondence, your browser history, think about that, your browser history, oh no, right? They see all of it. They see everything. But they don't do anything with it. They see it, they know it, but they just let it alone. And they don't do anything with it. How many people, and just raise your hand, how many people are comfortable with that situation?
Because what does it mean they know it?
Meaning they just have access to all of it. So it's stored somewhere. It's stored somewhere, but someone's actively viewing it. Someone's viewing it. But they're not doing anything. They're not doing anything. I mean it. They're not doing anything. They're looking at it. They see it. But they're not doing anything with it. So how many people are comfortable with that situation?
And they are you allowed to tell anybody?
Are they allowed to tell anybody? No. Let's say they're not allowed to tell anybody. Then you're okay with it. How many people are okay with it? Okay.
We say it's already like that, so why are you asking?
How many people are not okay with it, insofar as you're uncomfortable with the idea of it?
Kind of depends on what I get in return.
Okay. And what do you get? Well, you get services in return. Okay. So I think it's a fascinating question. Freedom is one of those words that It's the kind of word that Socrates would have loved because it contains a world of intuitions that mostly are not fleshed out when we use that word. One way of thinking about it, which I find helpful, is, and this is a distinction that goes back to Plato, but it was taken up, I think, really well by a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt, who's a modern philosopher, and by a colleague of mine, Rick Rapetti, who's also a philosophical counselor. And that's the distinction between freedom of will and freedom of action. Usually when we think of freedom in a societal way, the kind of freedom we talk about in law, the kind of freedom that is brandished up with a fist, that's usually freedom of action, which is I can get up, I can go where I want, I can talk to who I want, I can say what I want, I can think what I want. That's freedom of action. And that has to do with your agency in the world, right? Your capacity for acting in the world. And to the degree that that's inhibited by law, that's what we would say it's a constraint on freedom. The reason I asked that sort of unfair question about, well, what if everyone has this information about you, but they don't actually use it for anything, is because actually you could say very justifiably, them having that information is not trespassing on your freedom of action, like at all. You can still do everything you were already doing and whatever else you might want to do, and them knowing you in that way doesn't interrupt that. And so I could see that being an acceptable state of affairs, depending on the person. Another kind of freedom, this isn't exhaustive, is what we might call freedom of will. And freedom of will doesn't so much have to do with what you do out in the world. Freedom of will has more to do with your relationship to yourself, let's say, right? It's like a harmony between the different parts of yourselves when your capacity for making decisions in the service of your own good, rational decisions, but not rational in the sense of logical, rational in the sense that I'm actively making decisions in pursuit of a deeper good for myself in the long term, relates to parts of me that are appetitive, that sort of want to follow impulsive desires or fears. And so Harry Frankfurt thought, well, freedom of will really is when, to put it in a phrase, I want what I want to want, which is another way of saying the forces within me that push me to do this or push me to do that are instinctive and, let's say, lower, more animal, have a dialogue with that part of me that is reaching for aspiration, that part of me that wants to become a better person, be more in control of myself, not in a straining way, but to have a deep and fulfilling life, to have a more meaningful relationship with people, etc. And so freedom of will has more to do with the integrity of the person, how the parts of you relate to one another, and how together you are in what you feel and think and choose. You can have freedom of will and no one ever sees it because it has to do with your relationship to yourself. A lot of people talk about privacy as being a threat to freedom of action. And what I wonder is whether privacy actually has more to do with freedom of will. How much protection do we need in terms of our information to preserve that freedom of will? One of the things that we can do now is we can activate people's desires on the basis of knowing what they pay attention to, right? Which actually it helps to tear someone loose from themselves even more than perhaps they would be otherwise. That's different from deliberately not allowing them to do something. So I guess that's another way of saying it's complicated, and I think that freedom of action is a lot easier to measure out. In law, it's a lot easier to measure consequence. Freedom of will has to do with the interior integrity of a person. And I'm interested in the question of how that interior integrity relates to that person being, to some degree, unknown. kept silent, concealed? How much does our integrity as people rely on us not being known by others so that we can be known in the right way? It's just a question, but it's a question that I don't hear being asked very often because so much has to do with consequential harm. Did that address anything about your question, or did it just open more questions?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Right. First of all, I really appreciated the pun about being short of breath when it comes to spirit. And second, and this is not a fully formed question, but it's something like, what's the relationship between privacy and the sacred, let's say? Because like what, and specifically what keeps coming to mind, even on what you just said about like not being known, it came to, I think I was listening to some like evolutionary strategies, and a thought popped into my mind that kind of something like virtue or character is how you behave in conditions of like omniscience. Yeah, someone knowing everything about you, because then it actually pays off to be virtuous and be perceived as virtuous, right? So, and also what you were saying about the divine spark, right? Like for even allowing this, let's say, erotic knowledge instead of the pornographic, like I need to allow for the possibility that there is something like a divine spark, right? That we're not exhaustively known by just like knowing the data. Yeah, so I'm just like circumambulating around this relationship between like privacy and the sacred, and I'm not quite able to like put my finger on what I'm trying to ask, but hopefully, yeah, anything.
Well, let me see.
Did everybody hear the question?
Oh. Yeah. Yes. Was that a yes? Okay. So, what I'm sort of hearing in the question is, okay, if there's something sacred about the person, and we're losing access to that, or we're forgetting what that is, there's this intuition here, or this, let's say, this statement that one of the things that privacy helps to do is preserve that. But what actually is the relationship between having parts of you concealed, having parts of you not accessible to other people, and being able to access something that is deeper about your own humanity? How does one actually relate or enable the other? That's kind of the question I heard. Is that fair?
I think so. Yeah, it's like any meaning crisis when this relationship with this sacred has been sort of severed. Oh, sorry. Yeah, when the relationship with the sacred has been kind of severed, right? Like it feels like in this condition, it's just much more difficult somehow to even entertain the possibility that, yeah, like we're not exhausted. Like we don't know someone just by knowing everything about them. Mm-hmm. So to what degree is kind of rectifying that first kind of a precondition for, a Socrates being invited into something like the deliberations that you were talking about regarding the concept of privacy?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the thing that comes to mind is actually, strangely enough, the word ritual comes to mind. And one of the things that ritual does, or did, we still have it to some degree, but one of the things that ritual did is revealed and concealed simultaneously, right? Rituals were a way of people moving through pageantry, moving through roles and drama and characters that they could participate in, but that weren't identical to who they are. And to some degree, I think one of the things that I hear in your question is wondering at the loss of that a little bit, which is that ritual kind of clothes people in a certain identity so that part of them can actually be more pronounced. I'll give you an example. I went to a play once in New York City. It was a very famous play. It was called Sleep No More. It was probably the best instance of this I've ever seen. It's okay, bear with me, because I think this is actually better than me trying to describe it. I think this kind of tells the story. The play it wasn't exactly a play in a traditional sense. It was like a dance piece, but it was a site-specific, immersive piece of theater. And it became very famous because it was just tremendously, tremendously sophisticated. So effectively, it took up kind of an area of New York City that's a little bit run down in Manhattan, and an old warehouse building. And it takes place over 6 floors of the building. And what they do is they essentially recreate the story of Macbeth. But not a word is spoken. It's all wordless, it's all movement. But it's riveting and very gothic, very dark, very provocative, and very sinister. I was not prepared for how sinister this was. I mean, the play is very sinister. It shouldn't have been a surprise. But I was not prepared for just how sinister this play would be. And it was filled with violence. It was filled with sex. It was filled with like very jarring things that you're usually not used to seeing in a play, much less being this far from them. Because you're wandering through this building and you're given a task when you go in. And the task you're given is follow the heat of your interest. That's the most important thing you do. You interact with this play by following your desire. Okay. What does that mean? And when you're going in, they give you a mask. You put on a mask, conceals most of your face. The only thing that is visible is your eyes. And I was unclear at first as to why they were doing that. Why do I need my face covered? I'm not the performer. Except I am. Because the idea was that you would be essentially free to go and see whatever you wanted to go and see whatever scene you wanted, follow whatever character you wanted, and you would have the experience that you had. But the experience you had would entirely be determined by where your attention naturally was directed. And the reason that your attention was naturally directed is because, why? Why do you think?
Because you were anonymous, so you didn't have to censor yourself.
Precisely. Because you were anonymous. They anonymized you in order so you could have an experience that would reveal something about your own attention. Now, this is not how this play was marketed. People thought they were going to watch a show. No, what they were going is to experience a mirror. What happened when they said, I saw this show, and it was an incredible experience, and I talked to other people who saw it afterwards, and something similar had happened to them, which is that because your identity is concealed, your appetites are inflamed. And then you chase what you're actually interested in seeing, not what you think is right to want, not what you think you should want to see, but what you actually want to see. And so what happens when you go into that show is you have a confrontation with yourself. That is something that privacy allows in that circumstances. It allows you to confront yourself without the shame of prying eyes so that something about your own attention can be revealed to you. It was a kind of ritual where you play a character that suppresses your identity so some part of you can be clearer to yourself. And in a nutshell, I think that is what privacy can do if it is ritualized properly.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize. I will be interested in something a little more technical because I'm an aspiring academic in psychology, and I'm curious about how exactly I could observe the reality of the meaning crisis if I were to collect some data from the history. Because you mentioned that it's too much of a dispersed phenomenon to be measured directly, but I think that very important phenomena bubble up into something measurable. I only looked at the statistics of the secularization or the rise of irreligion, and it seems like it's a pretty continual decrease in the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'll be curious, like what maybe was the tipping point in this continual trend, and if I, as a researcher, wanted to really see some like visceral manifestation that what you're describing is is a meaning crisis, is a lack of meaning. How could I observe it maybe most directly and clearly?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, I did say that it was so ambient that you can't kind of get your arms around it. And I think that's true. But of course we have, and John and I and Philip Mistrovic made this argument, a version of this argument in the first monograph we published about it, which was called Zombies in Western Culture. We had a fairly detailed statistical overview of certain things that seemed to be indicative that something was going very wrong. One of them, plainly, is just suicide rates, especially in the West. And suicide rates that are particularly dissociated from acute mental health disorders, right? There's actually a term that was sort of coined for these called deaths of despair, which is just a pervasive feeling of meaninglessness that moves people to want to simply subtract themselves from existence. A kind of intolerability to existence that comes from a sense of aimlessness or a disoriented or a weightlessness, when you feel as though somehow I'm unreal anyway. Something about me, something about my life, something about reality doesn't feel real. And so the suicide rates weren't alarming because they were just high, but they were alarming because they didn't have an associated causal relationship with all of those conditions that we know so well to be predictive of suicide. So that's just one example, but there was a fairly detailed rundown of those kinds of statistics. You talked about decreasing participation in religious institutions and religious rituals. That's definitely part of it. Most of these, I'd say, quote, empirical, unquote, indicators have a lot more to do with participation in ritual, participation in social custom, like the atomization of the family, people living further apart from one another, people no longer being clustered in tribes, perhaps in the way that they used to be, so that there's a solitariness, not necessarily a positives. I mean, there's a one way of thinking about solitariness is edifying, is profoundly helpful and necessary, but there's another kind of solitariness that is that's very inimical that's very harmful for people. And so we know that people are not living in big groups and families structures as much as they used to. So there are a lot of Mary Eberstad actually gave a really good account of this in a book called How the West Lost God, which is all about how the dissolution of the family structure, particularly the extended family structure, was correlated with the general decline of religious participation, which is really fascinating. So I would say a lot of this has to do with that, those secondary indicators that have to do with suicide, that have to do with mental health, but that also have to do with social isolation, loneliness, virtual escapism. There's a whole gauntlet of them. So there's a lot to say about this, but I think the short answer is yes, you're right. There's a lot that we can point to.
Yes, so thanks, Chris. You gave the example of a company that will collect the data from sort of like a top-down process. I was just thinking and imagining if we imagine a scenario where it would be some sort of a decentralized, transparent, encrypted process where the data are stored, but maybe they work on some platform that is decentralized, for example, blockchain, and the data could not be told to any other person or government, etc. I was just imagining a scenario where I have my personal counselor as an AI agent, for example, working on this sort of platform.
and thinking of three things. Whether it is desirable to conceal anything at all in this sort of scenario. Second, is you mentioned that you studied Kierkegaard, and you probably know that he talked about the three stages of life: aesthetic, moral, and religious. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, if this agent that I might have as a personal companion does not have an affect and does not have anything that we would call sacredness, is it possible that that agent can be somehow convenient companion in those realms? Because we were talking about freedom of will, and that relates to our wants. And there is other freedom, and there is freedom of thought and freedom of affect, perhaps. So maybe I will shorten it to those two questions. So first question was whether it is desirable to conceal anything in this particular scenario. And the second is if in this imaginary scenario would be desirable to have the agent to help me maybe to find out about myself, anything about my affect or about my will that is related to something sacred. I don't know if it makes sense.
It does. It does. Yeah. What's your name, by the way?
Thomas.
Thomas. I'm sorry. I wish I had been asking all of you this as we went along. I meant to. I'm sorry. About your names. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a prescient question because it's some of the work that I'm doing right now with Sunday Labs specifically. Sunday Labs is a startup that myself and John Vervaeke are both advisors on, and that project is really about trying to. So I have to be very clear and careful about this. That we're trying to ask questions like that. What we're trying to do is, we have all this data about ourselves. We give it off. It's in the ether, right? It's like we're constantly, with everything we do online, everything we do on our devices, we're emitting. It's like a scent. It's like a smell that comes off of us. We're emitting data with every move we make. It's happening anyway, and companies are collecting it. What would it mean to find a way to capture all of that rainwater and actually put it in service of the person, like truly put it in service of the person? We're giving it off anyway. We have the capacity to collect it. Other people are already doing it who are not particularly concerned for our well-being. How do we use such a thing responsibly? Remember, too much knowledge. It's possible to have too much knowledge if that knowledge is not mediated in the right relational context. But we have the means now of collecting such things. So there's this very precarious existential question. What do we do with this? What do we do with all of this data? I mean, the whole Socratic process involves using observations of a person, reflecting those observations back to make what is less conscious more conscious, right? If the whole Socratic process is self-knowledge, why would we not use this data, this information about us, as a way of deepening that project? And I think that's a very good question, and we're thinking about that right now. On the most basic level, that project involves creating a technical home for all of that data that is unimpeachable, that remains impervious to any outside access, and that through technical means is completely safeguarded and kept within your personal use. That's the most foundational idea is it technically possible to collect all of that data from yourself, have somewhere to put it where it cannot be touched by anybody except for you? That's a question. So the question of whether that's possible in the first place is a question, okay, technically speaking. Then the question is, well, how does such data get used responsibly, right? Is it right to just give someone unfettered access to their own data? Well, I guess it's yours in one way, but getting absolutely inundated with data that you don't know how to process might not be the most Socratically helpful thing in the first place, because you can't sift through to figure out what's important and what's not. Also, it might confabulate, it might hallucinate, it might not be accurate, right? Just because it gathers data doesn't mean it knows how to interpret it, doesn't mean you know how to interpret it. So then we have an interpretation problem of how do we make use of this in a way that is actually helpful to you and doesn't A, deceive you, mislead you, overwhelm you, or give you even more anxiety than you had in the first place. What we don't want is for you to develop an image of yourself that is reduced to the bottom lines of what data can read. These are all really, really big problems. Let's say that was possible, though, that we could do that. Okay. Then what I hear you proposing is an agent. And by agent, do you mean kind of like an AI LLM, something like that?
Yes, maybe more advanced.
More advanced, yeah.
Text-based, it's making it imaginary.
Yeah. That really is the question. I have a lot of reservations, to put it mildly, about using LLMs in any kind of counseling or consultative capacity, because however well they synthesize information, I am convinced that you need a presence of mind for counseling. That is to say, the counselor has to know what it is to be like the presence, has to know what it is like to be with that person. There is a gravity, a consciousness, a feeling of being with the person that is just as important, if not more important, than any visible observation you could ever make about somebody. In fact, we know from some pretty extensive studies that the effectiveness of therapy has very, this is a big statement, but there's a lot of research behind this. The effectiveness of therapy has almost nothing to do with the particular modality of therapy. It has almost nothing to do with the style, the school, the technique, the method, none of it. It's almost incidental. What's the thing that predicts a positive therapeutic outcome? There you go. You guys all know. You get it. It's the relationship. And the relationship is a presence of mind, a presence of being there with the person on a related journey. And it's not obvious to me that an LLM, even one that's actually more advanced interpretively than the ones we have now with GPT, etc., can provide that. I don't know what it would take to convince me otherwise, but so much. For example, one of the great insights that Carl Jung had is that for therapy to be real and to be effective, the therapist has to change and be impacted by the process as profoundly as the client. And that involves the unconscious as well as the conscious life of the counselor. That there is a mutuality, a bidirectional nature, right, to that process. Both are participants equally, and both are changing through the process. There are so many very textured, very embodied aspects to that I don't think are captured, at least now, by these technologies. Having said all of that, if we're not talking about simply replacing a human being, if we're not talking about replacing the depth and presence of mind that a person can bring, and we're talking about finding ways of intelligently representing your information to you in order to make proposals, make observations, suggest things, that I think is a much more reasonable proposition. And I think there is Socratic value in that, which is to say to have a device that can detect a pattern and go, by the way, Thomas, I've just noticed this. I've noticed like 18 times in a row over the last week, you've said this or you've done this. I've noticed a pattern. I'm not here to tell you what to make of that pattern, but I have noticed it. It might be relevant. Maybe you should think about it. And here are maybe some things that you could think about. Now, even that to me is a very bold proposal. But a proposal like that to me is fascinating and worth thinking about. And that's the kind of proposal that we're thinking about with Sunday Labs. Not something that can replace the role of a discerning partner, but something that can raise observations that there is no way you or anybody else could ever have detected. What is the right use of this technology in relation to our humanity seems to be the big question. How do we put this technology in service of humanity without undermining it or reducing it? And how much is too much? And is all of this already too much? I don't know. I do not have the answer to that. But I think it's a fascinating question. And it does seem like, well, all of this is happening already, and it's happening without any philosophical rigor or guidance or thoughtfulness. So there is a sense of urgency, I think we're feeling, to start at least adding a little bit of philosophical reflection, to add a Socrates to the process, to see what's responsible, what's possible, what we know, what we don't know. Yeah. I don't know if that answered any of your question, Thomas, but it's a good question.
I would say we have time for one more quick question. That's not. We will see. Try to make it concise.
So I had sort of an epiphany when I was listening to your story with the mask and anonymizing, because I'm practicing Tibetan Buddhism, and there's a lot of ritual there, and I felt kind of like disconnected from people that practice a lot of self-knowing. And now I got it that these are kind of different things, or there's like a struggle between self-knowing and anonymizing. And I'm wondering now how much meaning crisis is just about like being into self-knowing too much. Because let me illustrate, in the Tibetan Buddhism, there are practices actually that are like weakening your ego and identity, but they are actually in a way anonymizing you so that you can meet the world extremely powerfully. You, at one point, you start practicing deity practice, and first you get connected with the deity, but then you actually start becoming the deity. And in the ritual, there's actually a phase that you stop, you drop all your identity, and out of the emptiness you arise of the deity, and at that moment you meet the world extremely powerfully. And it seems to me that this way of anonymizing somehow keeps being left behind. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's good. What's your name?
Ondra.
Ondra? Yeah, I like that. The word that actually comes to mind as you said that is kenosis, which is the Greek word that means sort of self-emptying, which is present in a few religious traditions, right? This idea that I have to vacate myself, evacuate myself in order to make room for something that's deeper, older, more real than I am. And by participating in what is more real than I am, I become what I am. It sounds like a paradox, because it is, right? By emptying yourself, I mean, the Christians talk about this in reference to Jesus Christ, right? That it is not I who live, but Christ that lives in me, as Paul said, is I evacuate my egoic self in order to actually access the original identity, which is dependent on a power greater than mine. Kierkegaard has a line like that, right? When I come to rest in the power that established me, only then do I become a self. So, yes. So we have to differentiate what we mean by the self. Ugh, what a task, right? In this context, self-knowledge can mean like, we can mean it egoically. We can mean, I like to know myself in the sense of autobiography, right? those of you who follow John Vervaeke, he rails about this a lot, justifiably, which is that when people become obsessed with autobiography, they become precious about it. It's like, I want to know myself more, and knowing myself is knowing every detail about what I've done and what I like and who I am in the world. And it has to do with all of the accoutrement, all of the stuff that relates to my sense of identity. And I don't think that's really what Socrates means by knowing thyself. What Socrates means by knowing thyself is actually much more like what you mean, which is accessing the where from, accessing that font, accessing that place from which you emerge, that place from which ideas come, that place from which movements move you. Doesn't mean you know what those movements are. So self-knowledge is about self, let's say with a capital S, right? The totality that produces us from which we emerge, not that faint ego that is constantly trying to assert itself in the world. That self-knowledge relates to the deeper sense of self that begins to become accessible to us when I think we are in reverence to something that is properly more real than we are. And yet, that is also somehow identical with us, right? I mean, that's the paradox, right? Like what I am is somehow simply what is greater than me. And by realizing and remembering that and resolving myself to what I already am, I become what I am, right? This is the great existential spin that always turns people upside down, justifiably, because it's very hard to do and understand, right? But it has something to do with, I think, what you're talking about. Yeah. You have all been incredibly patient and such good sports, and thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for just being so thoughtful with your questions and just for making space for me today. I really, really appreciate it. This was really fun. Thank you. Thank you.